All right, guys. Tonight we are looking at the American Revolution Part 2. These notes we're going to break up into two further parts. The first being the Battle of Saratoga, which we'll see as the turning point of the American Revolution. And then we're going to look at the last years of the war. So we're starting with the Battle of Saratoga, which is the turning point of the Revolution. So after the Battle of Trenton, even though George Washington had won this victory, he continues to avoid large battles with the British. He knows in an open field, in an open battle, his troops won't be able to match with the British forces. So he fights a defensive war, trying to wear the British army out. The British aren't going to just chase Washington all over, though. They are going to come up with a plan. Their plan is to cut off New England from the other colonies. Their thinking being that New England has kind of been the source of all of or most of the troubles before the Revolution. If they can isolate and cut off New England, then they can kind of squelch any sort of resistance amongst the other colonies as well. So, to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies, you need to control New York. The New York has a long border with the New England colonies. If you can capture and control New York, the state of New York, then you're going to be able to isolate the rest of New England, or New England from the rest of the colonies. So the British plan involved having three armies meeting in Albany, New York. However, the British plan didn't really work the way it was supposed to. One reason was because General Howe, who we know has conquered and taken control of New York City, was supposed to leave New York City with his army and travel northward up the Hudson River. Howe doesn't go northward, though. Instead, he takes the opportunity to go south and capture Philadelphia, the capital for the colonists. You might think that's, in a way, that's a victory, taking control of another major city, but that really leaves the troops who are expecting to meet him in Albany at a severe disadvantage. The second issue is they were expecting some Indian allies to show up and help them, and they did not. And there were also forces that were supposed to come from the west and meet in Albany, but they were turned back by a small continental army. So this left one British army marching towards Albany as opposed to three like they were expecting. And here's a picture of the region to give you an idea. So if we start on like the left side, on the west side of the map, you can see there's a red line that shows British troop movement moving towards the east, and it says St. Leger. So we had an army marching from Lake Ontario, and it was supposed to meet in Albany, but it was turned back. You can see there was a couple battles in which they were forced to retreat and go back. If you see at the bottom of the map, there's an arrow pointing to New York City. Howe was supposed to be taking that Hudson River up and meeting in Albany. Instead, he goes the other direction, and he goes south to Philadelphia. So no troops are coming from the west, and no troops were coming from the south. There is, however, troops coming from the north, led by a general by the name of Burgoyne. Burgoyne is expecting to meet two other armies at Albany, and hopefully those combined troops will be able to beat the Continental Army, who is led by Gates, which is stationed in the area. However, he doesn't meet those other groups because they never make it. So he goes from a situation where he's expecting to badly outnumber the Continental Army to where he is badly outnumbered. And at the Battle of Saratoga, the British, as we say, run into a much larger force of American troops. And this larger force was able to cut off the British escape route back to Canada and cut off their supply lines. So after fighting several battles around Saratoga, the outnumbered British army is forced to surrender. And so an army of 5,000 men in October of 1777 surrender, and you can see the picture there of General Burgoyne surrendering to General Gates. Now, this is a big military victory. And that is helpful, but this isn't why the Battle of Saratoga is considered the turning point of the war. The reason it's the turning point of the war is because Benjamin Franklin now has some ammunition to use. Benjamin Franklin has been in France, and he's been trying to get the French, who are the natural rivals of the British, to get involved in this conflict. The French are mad at the British following the 7 Years' War. These two countries have a long history of fighting each other. And Benjamin Franklin's been trying to convince them to get involved. But he's really had nothing to use to convince them other than please just help us out. Now, following the Battle of Saratoga, he can point to this and say, look, we have a real chance. We have just defeated a British army in an open field battle, captured 5,000 troops. And this is just what he needed to convince the French to get involved. So France will get involved on the side of the Continentals. It is going to send troops, it's going to send ships, it's going to send money and supplies just when the Continental Army needed it the most. And that leads us into the last years of the war. So although the American victory at Saratoga is a huge turning point, it's not the end of the war yet. The British still controlled New York City, and they still controlled Philadelphia. So following the Battle of Saratoga, we're heading into the winter months, and Washington and his army winter outside Philadelphia at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. So they're spending about 6 months in Valley Forge, and it is a terrible winter for Washington and his army. They didn't have enough food. They didn't have enough supplies. Many men are dying, some from starvation, some from freezing to death. Washington loses about a quarter of his army from combined effects of disease, exposure, which is basically freezing to death, and malnutrition is linked to all this. They just didn't have enough food. You can see from this famous painting, The March to Valley Forge, it gives you a sense of the conditions these soldiers were dealing with. You can see, obviously, it's cold. They're in the middle of winter. Snow's on the ground, and the soldiers just don't have the supplies. Many of them are bandaged, wounded from battle. Many of them, their clothes have been torn and worn down, so you can see their legs are exposed. I don't know if you can see really well, but that soldier in the very front right, he doesn't have any shoes. He's lost his shoes over the course of the fighting. So these soldiers are wintering without the necessary supplies and food to get there. And Valley Forge is really one of those famous moments in the history of the Revolutionary War. And even though it's terrible and miserable, there are some positives that come out of Valley Forge. The first is that Washington uses that winter, those 6 months at Valley Forge, to train his troops. And they come out of Valley Forge much better trained and much more disciplined. They're much more well prepared to fight the British in open field battles than they were going into Valley Forge. And also, by this point in 1778, early 1778, the French are getting involved. Their money and their supplies are arriving from France. So shortly after because the French are getting involved, the British decide that they can't control both Philadelphia and New York City. They decide that they're going to leave Philadelphia, and they march out of Philadelphia, heading north towards New York City. Washington and his troops at Valley Forge catch wind of this, and they meet those troops at a place called Monmouth, and they win a big battle there against the British in June of 1778. After this point, the British are going to change strategies. They're not going to focus on cutting off New England. They're going to shift their strategy to the south, to places like South Carolina. And their strategy in the south was very similar to the strategy in the north. Capture the big cities, Charleston, Savannah, hold on to those large cities, and from there try and put down the revolution. In the south, we have fierce fighting in the Carolinas, North and South Carolina. And we have Americans fighting on both sides. We had loyalists fighting with the British, and we had patriots fighting against them. Both sides are winning battles, but neither side is really getting a knockout blow. They'll fight an open field battle, and one side will retreat, and the other side isn't able to press their advantage enough and capture them. And this goes back and forth, both sides winning, both sides losing, for several years. And this is long and drawn out until 1781. And in 1781, the British and the French are finally able to pin down the British Army. The British Army in the South is led by Cornwallis, and he has his troops at Yorktown in Virginia. And what happens is that the American Army surrounds them on one side, and Yorktown is on the coast, and the French Navy is on the other side. So they've got the British penned in, and they've trapped them between the land forces and the French Navy. And so Cornwallis is forced to surrender. And this effectively ends the fighting in 1781. The Continental Army has been successful. Cornwallis surrenders on behalf of the British.